Windows Subsystem for Linux with Craig Loewen.
The Azure DevOps Podcast is a show for developers and DevOps professionals shipping software using Microsoft technologies. Each show brings you hard-hitting interviews with industry experts, innovating better methods, and sharing success stories. Listen on to learn how to increase quality, ship quickly, and operate well. And now your host, Jeffrey Palermo.
Welcome to the show. I am Jeffrey Palermo, your host for helping you and your teams move fast and deliver quality and to run your software with confidence in Azure, all while using everything that the .NET ecosystem has to offer. The podcast is sponsored by ClearMeasure, a full-service software architecture and engineering firm that serves companies that are building mission-critical software systems. Quick announcement, we are in the second year of my Architect Forums. You can sign up for the next session in the link in the show notes. And if you lead a software team, and if you're looking to collaborate with other peer architects or team leaders, just sign up at that link. We'd love to have you. Also, we're launching a new software leadership forum for technical executives who oversee software engineering groups, whether it be a CTO, a VP of engineering, an engineering director. If your role is to oversee software development teams, but you're not in the role that you're directly in the team committing code with them, this forum is really for you. It'll focus on topics that are specific to management and leadership for those software engineering departments. And if you're in one of those teams and you would like the manager or executive that oversees your team to be in that group, then please pass it on. That link is in the show notes. And for those who are looking for Programming with Palermo, my video podcast, you can just search for it in any of the directories and you'll be able to find it. My guest today on the show is Craig Loewen, and he's had a love for technology ever since he was a child, and he's grown passionate about building things that empower people, from constructing his own quadcopter for photography to delivering developer tools that aid developers in driving technological improvements and innovation. He's pretty much done it all. As a product manager at Microsoft, he's responsible for the Windows Subsystem for Linux, or WSL, which is a developer tool used by over 3 million developers and IT professionals. And he defines the product vision and prioritizes the feature roadmap based on customer data, technical feedback, and market studies. But on the personal side, he volunteers as a mentor at First Robotics, where he teaches high school students how to build robots and foster a passion for STEM. Craig, welcome to the podcast. How are you, sir?
I'm doing very well. Thank you very much for having me.
Oh, my pleasure. My pleasure. We had a recent guest, Kayla Cinnamon, who started talking about Windows Subsystem for Linux. And of course, we haven't had that topic on the podcast for a while. And you've recently, you spoke at Build in one of your sessions. We'll include that link in the show notes. But you've done a ton of work. So no better person to kind of give us an update on what the state of WSL is for .NET developers and on Windows than you. But I want to ask you about that. I'm chomping at the bit. But before I do, as the listeners get to know you better, can you back up a little bit and tell us about your journey of what were the high points in your career that kind of steered you in this direction where you are working on this really important piece of tech inside Windows?
Yeah, for sure. So when I started at Microsoft, I was actually an intern. So I started in an internship back in 2017 while I was at school. And I worked on the command prompt, so Windows console at that time, and also the Windows Subsystem for Linux team. And some of the cool things that I did when I was an intern were like I made the default colors more accessible inside of the console window, and also worked on some WSL features. And I realized I really liked the product. And so when I finished school, about 8 months or so later, I came back and joined as the WSL PM full time. And so since then, the really fun things that I've enjoyed are things like we added the ability to run Linux GUI apps on Windows. And my favorite part about that was we decided they should look like regular Windows applications. They should be in the taskbar. They should be in, when you Alt Tab, they should live there. They should be in your start menu. But then it really looks like Linux, like it has the full GTK tiling at the top. Mm-hmm. And then most recently, We also launched the Windows Subsystem for Linux version 2, type distros, which use virtualization. And that's added a ton of new features like GPU support for AI development. And we're adding a lot more enterprise features for it recently as well. So those are some of the things that I've really enjoyed working on so far at my time at Microsoft.
Nice. Well, that's huge. And I remember when it first was announced as a preview, everyone's saying, and it's not a VM, it's just there. And so how how it works is kind of some engineering marvel. But there's still developers out there who've never given it a shot, or maybe if they have installed it, it's just to get Docker Desktop working, or .NET Aspire has come out, which kind of WSL is kind of in the dependency stack there. But catch us up on what are the most common use cases where devs are missing out if they're not using it for those.
Yeah, for sure. So I think the biggest use case is, hey, I love using Windows, but I also love using Linux. Or perhaps I need to use one or the other. For example, I'll talk for me personally. On my personal computer, I have a gaming setup because I do like to play PC games. Mm-hmm. So I have a nice graphics card. But there's also times where I want to mess around with some AI development, or use my GPU for some development workflows. What's great is I want to be able to use Linux tools for that, and I don't want to dual boot because I like having all the disk available on my system and not have to swap between two environments. And so WSL is really the place where you can get the best of both worlds, of being able to use your favorite Linux tooling while also being able to have access to everything Windows. And it all feels like the same machine. And so that's kind of coming from the perspective of, I'm someone who really loves Linux in a lot of ways. But even if you're not a fan of Linux, you can really, with low stakes, try out a full Linux environment. Like you can literally run wsl - install Ubuntu or Debian to install that distro and try it out on your system without necessarily having to pave everything over or set up a dual boot. So I just really recommend it as a way to get started with Linux or bring your favorite Linux workflows over to Windows.
Okay. So you mentioned distros. Again, for the folks who haven't kind of done anything, do they need to decide anything? What's the decisions that you need to make in order to, before you get into the terminal and type your first Linux command?
Right. I think it comes down to, you have a need for Linux as kind of the first starting point of, let's say that I want to get started with Node.js development, and it's a tool I've never used before, but I know my production server at work uses Linux, so I want to use my Linux tools for it. Which is a really good, perfect example of why people might get started with WSL, because they want to match production, right? Mm-hmm. And so you might not know anything about, how do I get started with a distro, or what even is a Linux distribution? Literally, to get started, you can run WSL -- install. That will install everything that you need. You can run it from PowerShell or CMD. Install everything. We by default install the Ubuntu Linux distribution for you. It's just basically, to oversimplify it, it's just a Linux environment, right? It's like a place where you can run your Linux commands, have your Linux files, run your Linux binaries, etc. And we install and set that up for you. And then on reboot, it will start up. And from there, if you go to aka.ms/wsldocs, we actually have getting started guides and tutorials there for different workflows like Node.js, training AI, or even just, hey, what are some Linux commands that I can run?
Mm-hmm. Do you have any favorite Linux programs, like GUI programs, that you find that you like running in this way?
Oh, yeah. Probably some of my favorites. Recently, I guess in terms of use, I really have been using Postman a lot inside of WSL. And I've also been using MongoDB Compass inside of WSL. The other things that I've used in the past are things like Audacity, because I wanted to grab some like very fast version of it. And I've always test, anytime we release a new build, I test Blender on WSL because it's the most graphic intensive, GPU intensive program I can think of. That's really easy to install.
Okay. Well, some of the announcements at the build conference, and some of them, I mean, you've probably been working on them all year, but DevHome was one of the the new features, and there's some new WSL goodness that intersects with DevHome.
Yeah. So DevHome, just to give a quick level set, is a way for you to have like a companion app for your development environment, and then really any development workflow that you have. And so what we did is we wanted to add and often ask for feature requests for WSL, which is, hey, I want to be able to manage the WSL distros from a GUI perspective, so from a graphical perspective. And we decided DevHome would be a really good place to put that information. And so what we did is we've actually partnered with a community member. So huge shout out to Carlos Ramirez from Whitewater Foundry. And he was able to do it totally open source. And he built an extension in DevHome that basically powers that experience. And so we are working right now to pull that in by default into DevHome. So what that gives you at the end of the day is you can go into DevHome. There's a new feature called Dev Environments, which allows you to see all the environments where you do development activities like a DevBox or Hyper-V VM. And we also include WSL now in that list. So you can install new WSL distributions, view your running distributions, manage them, etc.
So you can have multiple distributions side by side, all active at the same time.
Yep. Yeah, you can run Ubuntu, Debian, OpenSUSE, all simultaneously, and you can even run Docker on top of that if you like.
And these are not virtual machines somehow.
Oh, so the cool part is that we do now use a virtual machine. So what's really neat about WSL, it actually started from Windows Phone. So back in the day when Windows Phone was a thing, there was an investigation of, hey, can we run Android apps on Windows Phone? And so they looked at making a translation layer. So basically all of the Linux system kernel calls would be translated to Windows 32 kernel calls. And then that would then run on the Windows kernel itself. And that project, once Windows Phone was shuttered, then that project became WSL. And so the use case initially was, I want to be able to run bash commands on Windows. And that ran with a translation layer. And then it grew and grew and grew in size as we added more and more capabilities. And then the challenge of, and this is where we made WSL2 type distros, we moved the architecture over to a virtualization layer. And what's cool about that is we grabbed technology from Azure to power that. So we grabbed this thing called a utility VM, and it launches in under 2 seconds. And it has a kernel that's basically we can hot load into memory, and we skip a lot of the normal boot process on a normal machine. Mm-hmm. And you just type in WSL and you have it right away. And it, even though it's a virtual machine, we've done our best of making sure the integration is really tight. So it all feels like the same machine. You never have to worry about spinning it up or turning it off. Once you stop using it, we shut it down for you. And so the difference is WSL1 type distros are translation based. Okay. WSL2 are virtual machine based. And then WSL2 is the latest and default.
So what kind of memory should I expect to be consumed as I'm like add more and more distros?
Yeah. So initially when you start up the WSL VM, are you talking about disk space or memory like RAM?
I think memory is the more of a constraint than disk space for most people.
Got it. So if you start up if I start a distro, memory will sit around 400 megabytes, 500 megabytes if I just have bash open and nothing else. And then as you use programs in it, so as I use let's say I open Blender, for example, then the in-process memory will expand over time. And so it will start at 500 megabytes. And let's say I add Blender will grow it, with the in-process memory, maybe by a gigabyte. So then I'll be at 1.5. Mm-hmm. We actually recently added improvements to WSL to help manage this memory. So it grows over time. And then now we have the ability to shrink it back. And so one of the things that Linux does is when you access files a lot, it caches all of those files to memory. And so that grows the memory size of our virtual machine over time. And what we added is now that when you stop using WSL and are idle for about 5 minutes, we drop those caches for you. And so if you leave WSL on and go get a coffee and come back, it will go back down to the resting value of 500 megabytes if you're not running anything.
Mm-hmm. Okay. And from a strategy perspective, is this aimed squarely at workstation only or development scenarios only, or are there scenarios where there's perpetual running services where it's kind of like a local server as well? What are the best use cases that it's designed for?
Right. Great question. And so the use case that it's designed for is for development purposes. We made a lot of choices in WSL to make it best for developers. So I'll give a really good example of, we start your WSL VM for you. So when you run WSL, if you're not running it, no VM exists and no memory is consumed. And then when you start it up, we take a little bit of memory and grow as you use it. And then when you stop using WSL, we shut the VM down for you, which is great for development because I get all the resources on my machine, but might not necessarily be the best thing for like a production server if you're expecting that it's always on and always hot for any requests. And so it's best for a development environment, but our official guidance is, hey, we build this for developers and we maintain and fine tune it for developers, but it can also be used for production. And then we list out the caveats of it. It's not exactly like one-to-one to a regular Linux environment. Like that's a really easy example that I gave of the starting up and shutting down automatically. But we list them out, and if you want to use it for production, you can. The other thing that we can recommend is there's a product called eFlow, which is a good way to run Linux services, and that one is targeted towards production scenarios.
Okay. One of the things that is still a little bit difficult is if I'm targeting a production environment in Azure, it's tough. I can't just take those Azure services and run them locally. Right. Yeah, I literally have to have all the environments in Azure because I can't take Azure Kubernetes service and run that locally. But I could run, a mini cluster of Kubernetes,
right? But
only if I run it in WSL because Kubernetes literally is built for Linux. And of course you got the Docker services and like services like Portainer that make it easy to throw in some Docker tools and whatnot. Are there people that you know of that are spinning up mini Kubernetes clusters in WSL just for local testing scenarios? Is that a good use case?
Many thanks to our podcast sponsor, ClearMeasure. ClearMeasure is a software architecture company that empowers clients' development teams to be self-sufficient, moving fast, delivering quality, and running their systems with confidence. Whether starting a new project or developing new technologies or techniques, ClearMeasure sets up your team to deliver world-class results. Learn more at www.clearmeasure.com. ClearMeasure, empowering software delivery. ClearMeasure is also happy to be a sponsor of the video podcast, Programming with Palermo. Watch, learn, and program alongside Chief Architect Jeffrey Palermo. Videos are added weekly and available on syndicated locations supporting video podcast or by visiting palermo.network. Tune in today.
Oh, yeah, for sure. There are multiple teams that I know of that are using exactly that workflow. They're using things like Minikube or K8s, micro K8s to spin up local Kubernetes environments, do some level of testing, debugging, and running in that environment, and then sending that to the cloud.
Okay. So everything is persisted. We don't lose any state, even though you're spinning up and spinning down automatically.
So what's cool about WSL is, like you won't lose state in the sense of, like, for example, let's say I'm using micro K8s and I'm using micro K8s and I start up my WSL, I open my terminal window, I run some stuff, and then I go, that was great. And then I leave micro K8s running and I close my terminal window. The actual, thing that we're doing behind the scenes is we're testing, does WSL have any open Windows file descriptors? So do you have a terminal window open? It would be an example of that. And if you do, we leave it up. And then if you don't, after a minute or so, we start the shutdown process. And so we shut it down like any other virtual machine. And so that microcates, basically system daemon would get a shutdown signal, clean up, and you wouldn't lose state. It'd just be like your computer turned off in like a regular bare metal Linux analogy.
Okay. So one of the, whether it's an announcement or just a feature, is local AI, small language models, or making use of that. What can developers do today in that area? That's an intersection with Gen AI and WSL. So are there scenarios that work really well already that developers can try out?
Oh, for sure.
Okay.
I would highly recommend checking out. It's called VS Code AI Toolkit. It is something new that was launched in this build, so just a few months ago. And the scenario that you can use for that is basically, hey, I can run SLMs or small language models locally. So I'll try and really over-explain of, LLMs, large language models, are things like ChatGPT, of like interacting online, or Bing Chat. They can answer really complex questions via text and do smart completions and chats to text messages. And an LLM is just a large version of that. SLM is a small language model, which you can run in a small context because, it might take up 5 gigabytes on your machine. That's the small version of it. And so they might not know as much as a large language model, but they can be used for really interesting use cases locally. And the example that I'll give is with VS Code AI Toolkit, you can download one of these small language models, and then you can fine tune it on local data. So for example, if I wanted to have ChatGPT, but I wanted to output everything as a knock-knock joke. Like anytime anyone asks it anything, I want a knock-knock joke variant to come out from it, and I want it to have these specific kinds that I like. You could create a training data set of that. Of, hey, here's the user input, and then here's what I want outputted, and then you can train a model. Sorry, I keep using the word train. You need to fine tune the model because it's already trained, but you're fine tuning it for your additional data set. And you can make a version of a ChatGPT, a language model that has your specific outputs and is fine tuned to what you'd want it. And so that all can be run in VS Code AI Toolkit, and that's all powered by WSL at the end of the day. So one of the dependencies in that chain is the Windows Subsystem for Linux.
So this is a tool that you can't just run on Windows by itself. It does have Linux dependencies.
Yeah. The tools that's being used in it does have Linux dependencies, and so it depends on WSL on your system.
Okay. The models that have been trained on different languages and can do, say, real-time translation back and forth between English and Spanish. Do you know if those are classified as small language models or large?
Good question. I don't know off the top of my head to give you a definitive yes or no. But what's kind of fun is with these language models is you can kind of play around with them to see which one's best. And they have the problem space of, okay, all of text, any text that you can input is just so huge. It's hard to really tell how good is it at this or how good it is at this other scenario. That's kind of why I like the VS Code AI Toolkit setup, because it's really easy to download and try out a bunch of these different models. Like you can try Llama 3 from Meta or Phi 3 from Microsoft, etc.
Yeah. Well, tell me if I'm thinking about this right, but I'm thinking of some scenarios where, locally we could integrate it with our own custom applications through WSL, but we could, test it out and then deploy it to production. Is if we're validating input. Now there may be easier ways to do this, but we could have a profanity filter where it's just monitoring everything that goes through and just strips that out. Am I thinking a small language model could do a task like that?
Yeah, I think that'd be very reasonable. The one that I showed, so I did do a talk about this at Build, and one of the ones that I built for that talk was we have a bunch of GitHub issues come in, and we label those, right? Like this is a duplicate, or this is related to this specific area of the code. And so I took a whole all of our historic data of how we labeled those issues. And that was my training data of, you get this issue description, and I want you to output these issue labels, right? So for something like WSL, it'd be, okay, if they, I'm opening this port and it's not opening and, connecting via localhost, that's a networking issue, is what we kind of showed as our fine-tuning data set. And then the output of it after training was you can type up a issue, and then it would label this as, yeah, that's related to WSL and that's related to networking. And so it's that kind of level of, if I tried to do that with a large language model like ChatGPT, it would have no idea how I label issues or how my team labels issues. It's really kind of best for something like domain-specific knowledge, or something that you would not be able to ask ChatGPT, but you could give it enough data where you could make your own version of that model that knew that really specific, oh yeah, this is related to networking in WSL. This is related to GPU in WSL.
Nice. Yeah, it seems like we only have scratched the surface on figuring out these little tasks that a small language model, and 5 gigabytes, I'm wondering if there's going to come out with a tiny language model where it's trained on just enough to be able to reliably make good recommendations for a certain set of tasks. And
right.
It seems like a year ago, it was, whoa, let's play around with ChatGPT. And now a year from now, it'll be, okay, now I can actually apply this, and we'll have lots of examples of people they've really embedded it in production systems and know what works and what was a disaster.
Exactly. Yeah. And that would be kind of the goal of what's really great about these small language models is something like Phi, which Microsoft builds, for example, and releases. There's a version that's designed to run on mobile applications because it's that level of small. And so it's really cool seeing all the different ways that people are looking at, okay, in which ways could this be useful? Like a really good one that, just off the top of my head might be cool is if I'm searching something on my phone, is there a way that you can have that search the meaning of what I'm trying to type rather than the keyword, literal search, things like that, I think are really powerful use cases.
Gotcha. Now, here's something else where I don't think it's exactly in WSL. You correct me if I'm wrong. Is Sudo for Windows? Did your team do that, or have an intersection with that?
So we are intersected with that. My broader team that I work on is called the Engineered for Developers team. And so I work on that team with Kayla, Cinnamon, as well as a bunch of other really talented folks. And that is owned by Jordi Adumi, and who's an awesome PM. And I can chat a little bit about it. It's basically adding the ability to run sudo in Windows. It's in the name, which is cool. And I really like it in terms of bringing Linux functionality to the Windows OS.
Well, maybe you can demystify it and what it is and what it isn't, because one of the most common things, and I've asked some developers about sudo, and they're like, oh yeah, well let me sudo apt get something. And so,
right.
But you've got the intersection with the package managers that is very common. But what is sudo, and what just happens to be around sudo but is not it?
Right. So sudo in itself, I'm going to try and be really pedantic on terms because I think it is hard of it's like overloaded. And there's the concept of sudo in Linux, which is just, hey, run this as root user, right? The Linux equivalent of administrator. I think it stands for super user do, though I don't know.
And whether it officially does or not, I think everybody in the industry just has gone with that because it just makes sense. Super user do.
Exactly. And so the sudo command itself is like a staple in Linux. And you very often use it for hey, I need to install something. Okay, sudo, give me super user permissions and I'll go install this thing. What sudo for Windows is the ability to do the same semantics, which is I need to elevate my permissions level for this one command. And so the example you use of sudo apt get, okay, well, apt get an apt, that binary doesn't exist on Windows. So that
Mm-hmm.
command would fail. But if I wanted to do something like, PowerShell, like set my execution policy on scripts, is something that requires admin, for example. And I don't want to spawn an entirely new terminal window with admin privileges. Now you can just type in, on the latest versions of Windows, you can type sudo space that command that I want. And it's going to do the same semantic thing, which is I'm going to give you higher level permissions, and you can then run this command, just this one command, as that higher level permissions, and then you go back to your regular permissions.
Is this meant to be interactive commands or also unattended commands?
I would say it's both. So you can actually kind of configure the behavior of how sudo on Windows works. And so that includes the ability of either spawning it in a new window by default or having it inline. And so you can customize it in that way and use it for either scenario.
Yeah, I can see this. I can see this changing the way that people write PowerShell build scripts, because there, in a lot of software builds, there's this one command that, okay, well, we have to have administrative privileges, so I guess we need to run the entire build script, under an administrative console, and with it, it's really not the case. It's like there's this one command that needs it, but not everything.
Right. So hopefully that can help simplify it. And, from a security perspective, you still use the security stack on Windows. You still use user access control to authorize administrator level access, et cetera. So yeah, I think it does open up some avenues of, PowerShell scripting, as well as just personal use of, I use it, when you talk about package managers, Winget is Windows version of apt and other package managers.
Mm-hmm.
And there are some times where Winget needs user or administrator level permissions. And I go, great, sudo winget install, et cetera, which works great.
Yeah. That's a muscle memory. I'll confess, that's a muscle memory that I have to remember, rather than just going back and do Windows XA, which is my my muscle memory for PowerShell as administrator.
Right.
So that's good. That's good. Well, as we close up here, is there anything about the WSL2 that's really exciting that we didn't touch on just quite yet?
Yeah, I think one of the biggest pushes that we've done recently is adding the ability to have enterprise features for it. And so WSL is a really cool piece of tech. And as we kind of talked about, if I wanted to use Kubernetes or Docker, those depend on WSL on Windows. And so a lot of enterprises are running into this scenario where, hey, I have a fleet of Windows developers and Windows machines, but I'm moving to Linux in the cloud and I'm using Docker. How do I make this and scale this and make it secure as I'm rolling this out? And so WSL is a client-based virtualization tool. And then we have some of the best enterprise controls for client virtualization. And so they include things like the ability, obviously, to enable or disable it, like key security settings. We also worked with Microsoft Defender. And so Microsoft Defender for Endpoint can monitor all of the events that are running inside of your WSL distros, and they report it to your existing dashboards. So it all looks, you can look at the same Windows machine, and then you can look at its Linux events as well, which is really awesome. And then we're adding a bunch of new features coming up, like Azure or Entra ID, formerly Azure Active Directory. We're adding that integration with that, as well as better Intune integration, so you can report on things for like what distros are people running, what versions of those, and use those for conditional access scenarios. So, the ultimate message for that is, if you're a developer and you want to use WSL and your IT admins are saying no, like, please go show them the new features. And then if you're an IT admin, make use of those while rolling WSL out to your environment.
Nice. Awesome. And by the way, we will also include the link to your session at Microsoft Build, where you kind of went really in depth about the new capabilities of WSL.
Awesome. Yeah, we have some fun demos in that too, showing it live.
Yeah. All right. Well, as we close up, Craig, I really appreciate you coming on the show and sharing with us all about Windows Subsystem for Linux. version 2, right? Now we have to ask when's version 3 coming up. But no,
No.
2. But yeah, thanks for coming on. I appreciate it.
Thank you very much for having me. Really enjoy the podcast. So thank you.
Oh, fantastic. And until next time, keep shipping.
You've been listening to the Azure DevOps Podcast, a show for developers and DevOps professionals shipping software using Microsoft technologies. Go to www.azuredevops.show for show notes and other episodes. On behalf of your host, Jeffrey Palermo, and our sponsors, thanks for listening, and may God bless you.